back in college, I was involved with a research project and had become quite close with study participants in a small village near Manikganj, close to Dhaka. While we were there was a massive flood that struck, and we had to evacuate, but not before witnessing massive destruction to lives and livelihoods, homes and schools being washed away, kids' futures becoming uncertain. So I came back to Dhaka, shocked, raised about $10,000 in donations, bought emergency relief, and went back to the village to distribute it. When I came back to Dhaka again, I felt like a burden had been lifted off my shoulders. I patted myself on the back, and I have since shared this story numerous times in my resume, in interviews, in statements of purpose, as an unqualified success. What I failed to mention, and indeed admit to myself, is that I never followed up on the impact of those donated funds. To this day, I still don't know whether the farms are back in operation, whether the people got back out of poverty, whether the kids went back to school. Now the question is, was I serving them or myself? Much of development work is done from a similar sense of duty, of altruism, generosity, an urge to give back. And indeed, it's a noble thing. But is it enough? To tell you why not, let me share 3 different stories. The first story is from a few years ago when I was working with a top international NGO, writing a proposal for a $90 million project. The NGO had flown in an international development expert who did not really have much context, but she was amazing. We cranked out the proposal within 2 days. The problem is, we did all of it hunkered down in an air-conditioned boardroom and did not speak to a single member of the intended beneficiaries of that project. The second story is from an agriculture project in Bangladesh. The project was meant to increase access to information for farmers. However, pretty early in the project, it became quite obvious that even more foundational aspects were missing, such as reliable access to seeds, fertilizers, equipment. However, the funding from the donor side was earmarked, which meant that the project did not have any flexibility to change course and address those basic needs. As one farmer poignantly pointed out, should I sow paddy and eat rice or survive on information alone? The third story is from a well-known case, that of deworming. Study from Kenya, which was a rigorously done randomized trial, showed that deworming school children led to greater attendance and potentially even greater test scores. Based on that single study, tens of millions of dollars worth of deworming interventions were rolled out across the developing world. The problem is, study after study has since found that deworming does not seem to work as well in other contexts as it did in Kenya. And perhaps the interventions that it displaced, such as giving away free textbooks or giving sanitary napkins to girls, might have had greater impact in those other contexts. What is common across all of these 3 stories? What's common is that the beneficiary is conspicuously absent from all the discourses. Why did the beneficiaries not have a voice in designing, changing, scaling up, or shutting down interventions that would have such massive impact on their lives and livelihoods? In over 10 years of working with top development organizations in designing and executing projects, I've seen this same pattern play out repeatedly across contexts and across all the different stages of a development project's life cycle. In the design phase, there's often too little time, space, and resources to really dig deeply into the problem and engage beneficiaries meaningfully in the design process. In the execution phase, even if you have a flawless plan, it might not work on the ground for a variety of reasons. And the plans themselves and the budgets are often so rigid that you cannot do any meaningful course corrections, which means that gathering feedback from beneficiaries is almost a fruitless exercise. Moreover, the costs of an unhappy client is rather negligible, whereas your entire survival might be at stake if the donor blacklists you. Who would you be more worried about? In the wrap-up stage, impact is often measured shoddily or not at all. And when that fateful time comes, the best projects are just as likely to be wrapped up as the worst ones. Failures are typically shoved under the rug, and implementers and donors rarely have an honest conversation about what went wrong and why, and takes necessary steps to prevent that in the future. The field of development is actually an unmarked cemetery of thousands of such projects that were not designed right, implemented right, or evaluated right. And as a result, people, real people, suffered. And they never had a say in whether those same organizations got to work in their communities in the future. So why does this happen? Because deeply embedded in the altruism narrative is a huge power imbalance, that of donor versus recipient, do-gooder versus beneficiary. Ask yourself this: if you call someone your beneficiary, would you really allow them to ask you hard questions or hold you accountable? If you can answer honestly to that question, you would realize why you would never see an old woman frustrated at her flood-resistant house washed away by the seasonal deluge, holding their NGO representatives accountable for the failure. Since they don't pay in cash, they must pay in unquestioning gratitude. The power does not lie with them in this implicit social contract we've built. The power lies instead with the people footing the bill, the donors. In our case, we bend over backwards to please them at every cost. In their turn, they're often all too happy seeing a few pictures of beautiful young children in front of the dapper new school that was built in rural Nepal. God forbid should anyone ask the parents of those children what the quality of instruction in that school was. Contrast this with a business where they would have to sell their products and services, and therefore they would leave no stones unturned to tweak the product and the offering to the taste and idiosyncrasies of their audience. And those greedy venture capitalists we often complain about, they would not bat an eyelid before firing the CEO if the needs and wants of the consumers were not being met. Why do we treat our customers so differently in the development sector? At best, we are oblivious to our assumptions and biases. At worst, we deeply and secretly believe that beneficiaries don't deserve a seat at the table. This deep-rooted inequality in the heart of development was too much for my naive, young, idealistic self. So in 2016, I broke away from the development sector and decided to pursue a private sector approach to addressing the rural healthcare challenges of my country. I saw it as a way to be on an equal footing with my clients. After all, my money would be where my mouth is. If I did not satisfy my customers, my business would fail. This simple shift in incentives actually led to a whole different way of doing things. I sought after funding that was unrestricted and flexible. I traveled extensively for countless days and hours in rural Bangladesh, talking to my customers, understanding their pain points, and co-designing with them. I created new ways of measuring their satisfaction with my services and measuring impact. I was brutally honest with my donors and funders about what was going right and what was going wrong. And I changed course whenever things weren't working out. The terminology changed as well. It went from my beneficiaries to my customers. And when beneficiaries don't have power, customers do. This is a secret I might regret revealing in a public forum such as this. But I sometimes still feel that I don't understand the problem well enough to have an intuitive grasp of what might work after working on the problem for over 8 years. So, what is the solution for development? At a foundational level, I believe we need humility. Donors, NGOs, and governments alike needs to realize how little we actually know about the problems we're trying to solve. And that we really, in order to really solve these problems, we need to understand them from the perspective of the people who face it day in and day out. And for that, the key is listening. A great example of this was the late Sir Fazl Hassan Abed, who founded BRAC right after the 1971 liberation war that devastated the country of Bangladesh. And he started BRAC with a very simple philosophy: solve the damn problem. Instead of looking at donors' priorities, he looked at people's priorities. When he gave out microcredit loans and people were failing to pay back because of their health challenges, he went out, listened deeply to these people, and came back and designed what became one of the largest nonprofit health programs in the world. Building from first principles, listening to those whose problems you're trying to serve, and acknowledging when you're wrong. That is the key. In addition, we also need new tools and methods for development practice. Human-centered design, rapid prototyping, A/B experiments. These are all tools often borrowed from the world of startups and business that can help us iterate and learn quickly at a low cost in order to maximize the impact for every dollar, while also giving clients a voice in the process. Another way to do this is to charge service fees to clients, even nominally, which can reverse the accountability dynamics and create a very visible measure of when a project is failing to provide an acceptable solution to the problem they're trying to solve. But we cannot do any of this if the system and its inherent incentive structures remain the same. So one example is from a USAID project that my first company, Empower, was running, where we negotiated with the donor to allocate the budget on an annual cycle rather than for the entire 5 years in advance. What that allowed us to do was to allocate the budget at the beginning of each year based on the learnings and experiences of the previous year. And this meant that we could iterate quickly at a low cost and run many experiments and eliminate and improve the flawed ideas. Donors need to set the tone and create such flexible structures for implementers to iterate effectively and learn from their experience. They need to break down the silos of funding that prevent funding from being allocated properly. They need to tune in to the beneficiaries directly and really understand their feedback so that they can hold the implementers accountable. They need to guarantee continuity of these programs. Unless we are bold and are ready to dismantle and rebuild development from the ground up, challenging our deepest assumptions, beliefs, and biases, much of the billions of dollars of funding we spend in development every year will probably continue to serve our needs of meaning, of fulfillment, of sustenance, rather than the needs of those whose problems we set out to solve in the first place. Thank you.